I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this morning. I want to say a very special thanks to the New England Council members who have generously sponsored this morning's breakfast. Mass Mutual, who is here today, many of you know is headquarters in Congressman Richie Neal's hometown of Springfield, and is one of the largest employers in Western Massachusetts. It's represented today by some of the executive team: Michael Goodwine, Dominic Ianno, Eric Weinstein, and Justin Brown. I also want to recognize our board member who is unable to be here today, Allison Weiss, who is an extraordinary member of our board, and we value her support, her vision, her guidance, to say the least. NAREI is the National Trade Association for Real Estate Investment Trust, represented by Kathy Barry, who is the Executive Vice President in Policy and Public Affairs and General Counsel, who will introduce our very special guest in just a few moments. I would also just like to acknowledge the presence of former Congressman, the President of the University of Massachusetts, and a very good friend of our guest speaker here, Marty Meehan. We thank him for being here. And another distinguished president of higher ed here in New England, and a board member and chair of our higher ed committee, and that is President Robert Johnson from Western New England University is here. 23 has truly gotten off to a very, very busy start for the New England Council, and we have a full calendar of events in the next couple of weeks. And here in New England, we look forward to events with the mayor of the great city of Boston, Michelle Wu, Congressman Joe Courtney, and Senator Angus King. And in Washington, D.C., we'll host events this month with Senator Maggie Hassan and Representative Annie Custer. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our 2023 Washington Leaders Conference will take place on May 10th and 11th in our nation's capital. Registration just opened yesterday, and sponsorship opportunities are available. As always, you can find more details and register for our upcoming events on our website, newenglandcouncil.com. Today, we're delighted to welcome back the Dean of the New England delegation, and I might add, a former recipient, New Englander of the Year, and a tremendous advocate, not just for our region, but for our country, and that is Congressman Richie Neal. I thank you all again for joining us today. I'm very pleased to hand it over to Kathy Barry of NAREI to introduce our very special guest.
Good morning. Thank you, Jim, and thank you and Larry and everyone else at the New England Council for all that you do for those of us in this room, including opportunities to convene, hear from leaders and policy makers, and just to engage with one another, happily in person now. NAREI is delighted to be co-sponsoring this breakfast with Mass Mutual, a bedrock of this community. NAREI is the voice of real estate investment trusts, 12 of which are headquartered in Massachusetts, including two fellow New England Council members that are well known to you, American Tower and Iron Mountain. Excuse me. This morning, I am humbled and honored to have the privilege to introduce a man who needs no introduction, ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee and Dean of the New England and Massachusetts delegations, Mr. Richie Neal. Throughout his 18 terms serving Massachusetts' 1st Congressional District, Ranking Member Neal has always been a rare and prized politician, someone his constituents can always count on, whose reputation is due to his prescient vision for what should be done and his unfailing ability to work with anyone to get there. And a point of personal privilege, I'm told by someone at NAREI who has worked there since I was in high school that he was a longtime chair of the Real Estate Caucus, so we thank you for that. He is responsive to his constituents, generous with his time, open-minded to people with opposing viewpoints. And the work he has done has had real and lasting effects on Americans around the country. Mr. Neal was instrumental this summer in passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which focused on safeguarding families, pocketbooks, and their health, and encouraging investments in climate security in our homes and across industries, including in REITs. Through his leadership of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal has been a steadfast champion of bipartisan cooperation and a tireless advocate. Most recently, Mr. Neal secured the passage of his committee's retirement legislation in the end-of-year appropriations package, which will increase retirement savings for millions of Americans and enable more workers to begin saving for retirement earlier. Please join me in expressing our collective thanks for his ongoing leadership and service, and give a warm welcome to Ranking Member Richie Neal. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy, very much for those nice remarks of introduction, and thanks to the sponsors. They're all longtime friends and supporters, and we've enjoyed a great relationship with many of the business leaders across the country, never mind New England or Western Massachusetts. And I'm delighted to always accept the invitation of the New England Council. I'm a friend and admirer of Jim Brett, and I've always appreciated the manner in which the New England Council, on a bipartisan basis, advocates for the strengths of our region and tries to uplift the weaker parts of our region. And they understand how complicated the modern economy is, but there's always that great patience that they exhibit in advocating for our regional interests. So I was pleased with Kathy's introduction. There is a bit of humility that comes after you've been chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. But I want to tell you with great satisfaction how pleasing it is that the Republicans still call me Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think they sense something's coming quick. But during those 4 years, it really was, for me, an extraordinary opportunity to influence major national and indeed international events. And the 116th and 117th Congress, they are amongst the most well-achieved in the history of the country. So the recitation of what happened during those years, it's sometimes hard to point it out, because if we're not ginning up conflict 24 hours a day, or pumping out outrage, or avoiding the cable shows, or avoiding talk radio meticulously, then it's hard sometimes, I think, in the time in which we live, to explain many of the things that have been done. And I was talking to Speaker Pelosi a couple of nights ago, and we were talking about this at an event. We sat together, and we were going back and forth on what we'd actually done, which we did the first 2 years with former president, and the second 2 years what we've done with President Biden. And staggering in consequence. And I bring attention to that because, again, there was a time when conventional mainstream media could explain what had happened. But now it's become he said, she said, they said, we said. And that becomes the end of the story. So I think that when you look at what's happened, and even this morning, my staff informs me at 500,000 jobs again. That's unbelievable. I don't know how the Fed's going to interpret that. I'm going to see them a little bit later this morning. I never tell them what interest rates should be, but I tell them what I think. And just think of it. And last week, when the report was issued by the Labor Department, that we were at 2.9% growth in the last quarter. Here's what's amazing with the unemployment rate across the country, which dropped again this morning by that announcement. The other part of it, that it's been a strong job market now, even with the aftermath of the pandemic. And I'm not quite sure how the Fed will interpret that, but for the moment, think of this. Not only have we seen every job that was lost during the pandemic returned, there are 11 million jobs that go unanswered every day in America, right now. It's unbelievable what's happened. And I think that that growth uplifts everybody. And I think for the academic institutions that are here, and I'm thrilled that they are here today, it's also a reminder of where we've got to go with skill set, to get people ready to take these jobs that are available, because many of them, as noted earlier, are high-wage earning opportunities. So the Ways and Means Committee, we got shots in everybody's arms. As I noted, Dr. Fauci gave his warning on March 11th of 2020, and he predicted what was going to come, and boy, did it. But we immediately moved to get shots in everybody's arms. We proceeded with putting money in everybody's pocket, and we did $5 trillion worth of aid. So this week, I can't wait to see this reporter, and he's usually pretty good. He pointed out that it's alleged that there's $5 billion worth of fraud in those initiatives. I get it. Nobody's cheering on fraud. But I said to the speaker when we were talking after she read the article as well as I did, I said, we can tell everybody now, we were making it up as we went. And Secretary Mnuchin, to his credit, was in the room with the speaker and myself as we outlined the CARES Act, which saved the American economy. And the idea was cash flow for people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. People at the top didn't need the infusion of money, but technology allowed the immediate transfer of those dollars into the hands of people who needed them. The community bankers in particular, the credit unions, CDFIs, they all played a vital role in getting that money out. And I'm very proud of what we were able to do. And the Ways and Means Committee was in the epicenter of what happened. So the chaos and confusion that you often witness in Congress, there's also a corresponding story of achievement and what was done. I know that Massport's here today, what we were able to do with USMCA, against all odds. I remember Speaker Pelosi saying to me, you got to get this done because the former president was threatening to take us out of USMCA. And she said that'd be a disaster. And she was not a champion of NAFTA, I can tell you that. But she said to me, we've got to get this done. And here's how some legislative guile can play out. We also knew that the multi-employer pension plans were in trouble. And our friends from labor that are here this morning as well, I consider that to be a stellar achievement of the Ways and Means Committee. 2 million people had their pension saved. And for the critics of what we did, the trade-off was part of USMCA. Labor said, we'll go along with trade if you can do something about these pensions, and we did it. And we did it. And what I'm really proud of with USMCA? 193 Republicans voted for the final legislation, and 194 Democrats voted for it. I can't neglect the debt ceiling issue. It's right in front of us. But I wanted to say something about the debt ceiling question, because the Ways and Means Committee handles it. I think Joe Biden's right. We're not going to negotiate it. We'll hear what they've got to say, and we should. The CARES Act cost money. They voted for it on the other side. They voted for more military spending. So we're going to cut veterans' benefits and Social Security and Medicare. The debt ceiling is the weaponization of our responsibilities. We simply need to raise the debt ceiling and then have a discussion about what to do about federal spending. And we are still able to manage it even where it is. And none of us on the Democratic side are saying that we should be neglectful of this debt. What we're saying is raise it and then we'll talk about spending. So I will just say I was with a group of Republicans that were at an event with me yesterday morning, and they were nodding their heads as I was talking. I said, they can't win on this issue with the debt ceiling. And they can't win on a threat to shut down the government. For some of us that were there, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, they had a field day over shutting down the government. And we don't want to see a government shutdown, but we need to understand that you have to raise the national debt ceiling. And we will. And we will. I thought that the conversation, I could have predicted what Speaker McCarthy was going to say when he came out of the White House. We had a very good meeting because he's hemmed in. He's got a group on his side that eventually will acquiesce and we'll get the ceiling raised. But it's going to be a bit tumultuous, I think, for the next 4 or 5 weeks because for us to do a discharge petition, which means the legislation can be brought to the floor and eventually we'll get some Republicans to sign it. It's an ugly way to do legislation. But it's something that I think you'll get 10 Republicans that will sign on to it because it'll be very difficult in their districts back home to explain it. So let me take some satisfaction again for the Secure 2.0. I think senators will love it because they'll be able to stay there till they're 105. The Secure 2.0, we were at that for years. We did Secure and Secure 2.0. And when you look at how complicated the legislation is, but how simple it is as well, it's pretty extraordinary. And we just stayed at it. But, minimum distribution, now going to 75 years old, you're going to be able to use some of it for tuition relief. But the big thing that I have pushed for years in that legislation has been auto enrollment. I don't think it's a good idea to allow 23-year-old males to decide whether or not they're ever going to have to retire. Because they will never opt in if you say you can put the cash in your pocket. So what we say in the legislation, you're in. Sign something to say you want to get out. Good luck with that. But we thought auto enrollment was one of the biggest parts of it. And clearly, everything there in that retirement space was driven by what we were able to do. And I want to say this again about the Ways and Means Committee, if I can. Every Republican voted for my legislation on the Ways and Means Committee. Every one of them. And in the House, 5 Republicans voted against it. I don't have to tell you who they were. You could guess. I think that when you consider the infrastructure bill, when you look around here, what Boston did with infrastructure, a priority for me remains East-West Rail. As you know, Governor Healy is all in. She's going to be my guest at the State of the Union address this week. And I intend to use my time wisely when I'm with her to get those requests in. But I think that when you look at the CHIPS Act, when you consider the infrastructure bill and the Secure Act and USMCA and what we did in those 2 sessions of the Congress, it's not only remarkable, it endures right away to the benefit of the American people. Last couple of comments. Oftentimes, people hear Medicare, and they think when they hear Medicare, it's only for people at 65 years old. It's a great club, there's no question. You turn 65, you're in, no consideration of anything other than the fact you've turned 65. People frequently don't understand the relationship of Medicare to our hospitals, which are the best in the world, right here. Half their revenue comes from Medicare. It's extraordinary. And then another 10 to 15% in our major urban areas from Medicaid. So when you walk in the door between Medicare and Medicaid, that's what keeps the lights on. And when you also consider that idea of Medicare and its distribution of funds, how about the fact that we're the 14th largest state in the country and we're the 2nd largest recipient of National Institutes of Health dollars? And why in that ecosystem? It's because of the hospitals and it's because of the learning centers we have across the state. So we should always think of Medicare as not only first-class health care and the reason mom and dad are not living in your attic, but we also should look at it and say it finances the best health care in the world right here in our own region. And on the Democratic side, you should know we are not going to vote to give up a dime in Medicare and or Social Security because we understand that in this state and across the country, it's a massive employer as well. It draws people from all over the world to our institutions. I also would use this opportunity to say that I think that our continued support for Ukraine is essential. I think President Zelensky has been an inspiration to the world, and I think Joe Biden has handled it masterfully. And we've brought NATO around, and everybody understands that the menace that this aggression by Putin has caused. So I look to bipartisan support on that. I want to compliment the minority leader in the Senate. He stands with us on it, and I hope that the other side will as well. A couple of words about inflation. I understand what it does every day. It begins, in my judgment, right, to calm a bit now. When you look at what happened with supply chains, they're changing. And inflation had much to do, the supply chains had much to do with inflationary trends. But on the inflation front, when I hear the other side propose the fair tax, a 30% sales tax, inflation is cruel to poor people as it is. 30% sales tax? And you should know that's going nowhere, but if you just keep it amongst us, you can be sure I'm going to keep asking the other side, when will you be bringing that up? When will we have a full discussion on that? We need to get at that right away. We want to discuss that legislation. So I think that what we've been able to do with the issues that I've outlined for you, and many of the issues that I've personally been a champion of, there's another big one that that's in front of us right now. And I think that it provides a great opportunity for us, once again, to enhance our reputation, and it's ARPA-H funding. And President Meehan is here, and he's done a great job at the university, and we all need to row the boat in the same direction on that request, and I want UMass to be out front on it. We've got great universities on the private side, but we've got a great public university. And I have pointed out to the Biden administration that we want to make sure that UMass is front and center on that legislation. And as that decision comes down, we want to make sure, and I'm saying this because even from Western Massachusetts, I think it ought to be Boston-centered. I think that's a clear opportunity and advantage for all of us. So the last point I'll make, and I'll close, I think John Chester was coming over. I haven't seen him from the Globe, and he'd be disappointed when he wrote the story if I didn't bring up the issue of East-West Rail. The MBTA has had problems for 30 years, and real problems for the last 10 or 12. I understand from the western part of the state that you have to have a first-class transportation system in the capital region. Great. But the money that's coming to the state, which we drove much of in the committee, we want to make sure that there is improved passenger service from Boston to Worcester to Springfield to Pittsfield. I think that's a reasonable request. Now, Governor Healy says she's all in with me, and I want to thank Governor Baker. He was terrific on the issue as well. But we think that there ought to be some regional equity, ensuring that as we improve transportation across the state, that central and western Massachusetts are at the table as well. So, thank you. So with that, I want to say thanks again, and Jim, I'm happy to take some questions.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. I would just mention that the Congressman is very modest in his accomplishments. I've said this before, but we don't tend to value serious, thoughtful legislators. He mentioned the USMCA. What he didn't say is the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, said to the Congressman, I want to see a USMCA bill, and I want it passed in the House. Unfortunately, we have about 50 members of his own party that had problems voting for the bill, and she said, I want you to spend your time one-on-one with those 50. And he did, and that's one of the reasons the bill passed the House. And I remember Sherrod Brown, a senator from Ohio, who never voted for a trade bill, called Richie and said, I like what you put in that language. I'm voting for it. We don't value people like that today, serious, thoughtful legislators. When I was a young man, I looked at people in Congress who made a name by working on legislation. Today, they make a name by being entertainers on social media. And it's just too bad, because we need people who will work on legislation. Secure one, secure two. And getting all Republicans in this committee to vote for it, that's a lot of time and effort. But if we don't have people saying, I'm willing to work on legislation, we have a problem. We can't have all entertainers. People just saying, tweeting and saying, hey, I'm on social media, I'm making a comment, I'm going on the Talking Head show, and I'm going to say this. Who's doing the work? This man here, and we're lucky to have him, and needless to say. So with that, just going forward, Congressman, you had tremendous successes in the past. Usually in the new Congress, and Marty would know as well as you, the first 6-7 months is where the work is done. We've already had 1 month behind us, so there isn't that much left in the window before it starts closing. What do you foresee, if any, major legislation at all in the House going forward?
Thanks. Since Jim mentioned, I'm going to go back to USMCA because you'll get some of the humor in it. When Speaker Pelosi put her mind to something, I mean, I can't describe for you what it's like. So she kept saying to me, we need Dick Trumpka and Jimmy Hoffa. We need them. I said, I think if I get the multi-employer pension plans in front of them, they're going to say they're for this. So on the final day, I was in Boston. I'll never forget it. I was having an event at the Boston Pops that night, and the speaker was in Austria. And she said, as she was talking to me, she said, "Have you got Trumpka yet?" And I said, "I can't get him. He's hunting. He's up in the mountains of Pennsylvania. There's no cell service." She said, "We need him today." "Well, I'll go looking for him." And as she's talking to me, she says, "Look," she said, "I'm eating dates off a Christmas tree because I'm starving." And she said, "I'm going to call you back, and you got to find Trumpka." So I finally got Trumpka about 5 o'clock before we were going to the event. And he said, "Richie," he said, "you're good on the multis?" I said, "It's going to happen." And he said, "I'll send out the endorsement now. You can tell Pelosi what I'm going to do." That's the way legislators do things. So we solved two massive problems by that sheer patience. So I think that as you go forward, there's still some more room on the retirement space. My auto IR bill's going up right away, and I know ACLI's already indicated they're going to endorse it. And in addition to which, I think there's some room on the international trade front. One of the nice things about, again, being the chairman of the committee is all my alums are all over the Biden administration. And they call you back right away. They are really good. And so I'm talking to Catherine Tai, and I talk to her once a week. She comes in, and the USTR. She's a hardliner on China. You should know that. They're not going to ease up on that. But Taiwan, Japan, Europe, and Kenya are the priorities. So I think that we can get some Republican support on those four initiatives. I think that after we get through with heartburn over the national debt ceiling, there'll be some room to talk about spending. You're not going to grow your way out of this, but when they put out their budget, and I challenged them this week, where's your budget? Because President Biden's going to offer his budget on March 9th. And what we're trying to do, if you can just keep it to us, what we're going to try to do is say, where's your plan? Because we know their plan's going to have to touch Social Security and Medicare. We want that out in the open. They're going to say it doesn't, but we want to talk about it that way. So I think after that, there'll be some room for some conversations on what to do about debt going forward. Remember, the debt is the accumulation of annual deficits. So if we were sitting in this room 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, everybody was saying what a great job the Chinese were doing on the pandemic. 6 months ago, we were watching them beat up people in the streets over it. What we did on the pandemic was the success story. I know 1 million people died. There's no excuse for it. Overwhelmingly, nursing homes and older people. There's no excuse for what happened. We'll be better prepared. But think of the rebound that took place because of what we did. And it took place within a year. And how the economy continued to fulfill its possibilities because of the work that we took. So I think on the trade front, there'll be some talk about that. And I also think that there might be some room. I've talked to a couple of the Republicans who, I'm not going to tell you who they were. They said we might be open to some revenue on other issues. And I'm not going to give them up, obviously, because then they'll say they never said it. But I do think that there's a reality there based on what we did with Build Back Better. And if I can, on the Inflation Reduction Act, you know what's amazing about it now? It's the fossil fuel industries that are taking advantage of the tax credits. $370 billion worth of tax credits. And for me, the first one's up with the Koch brothers. And so when I was talking to the speaker the other night, I said that to her. I said, it's fine with me. If that gets them away from the fossils, fine with me. But what's in that Inflation Reduction Act, battery power storage, the tax credits across the legislation, and it was written by Mike Thompson and Earl Blumenauer, two members of the committee with great staff members. So you're going to see, I think, some movement, because tax policy really does take people in different directions. People that insist they're not going to do this or not going to do that, if you incent them, then they end up doing it. And if I said the other night, just as I was introducing Mike Thompson, you can be the most ardent Democrat in Houston. You can accept what's happening with climate change. But if you think you're going to lose your job, you're unlikely to vote accordingly. The tax incentives change all of that.
Time for a couple of questions. I know Sean Malone from our office has the microphone. So, young lady in the back. Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Emily Morton. I'm the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association, and I'm also a City Councilor. I'm actually not asking about an environmental issue, though. It's been wonderful to hear about the incredible victories on very difficult legislation. Would love to hear your thoughts what the path forward is related to gun violence.
Yeah. Well, I've supported every piece of legislation that has ever been offered on gun violence. And it's clear that even a state with the toughest laws has run up against reality. I think that we have to address the cultural acceptance of violence in America. I mean, I was a city councilor, incidentally, a few years ago, and I was mayor of a pretty good-sized city a few years ago. I know what gun violence does, and now it's on steroids compared to what it was even when I was mayor. Took a hard line on it, and at that time the argument was really over what we called the Saturday night special, that crime of passion that took place oftentimes in a liquor establishment. And now the availability and abundance of guns everywhere is extraordinary. And it seems as though our appetite for talking tough about it, but then accepting it, waiting for the next horror to come along, I hope it's run its course. And so the legislation that we've offered in Congress, I signed David Cicilline's bill again this week from Providence. So I hope collectively we can address that issue. And one of the things I also try to point out, we have never on the Democratic side taken the position that we want to confiscate the guns of hunters. We've never said gun collectors. We have said you need mental health background checks. Spousal abusers should not get guns. There are learning permits for a driver's license. There's a procedure here, and I think that we could do a far better job given the horror of what we've all witnessed just in the last few weeks.
Other questions for the Dean? Michael Taylor. I'll just wait for the mic.
I'd like if you could talk a bit about the 25-year career trial and your personal investment in that.
Thanks. We're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. I talked to Bill Clinton recently, as you might expect, with that modesty that he is known for. He'll be front and center. And I talked to Secretary Clinton, and she intends to go. I was talking to President Meehan, and we intend to be there. The dimension that America offered to the Good Friday Agreement as the honest broker is incredible. The longest standing political dispute in the history of the Western world has been brought to heel. And I'm not saying that they have fallen in love with each other, because that would be not truthful. But reasonable people can find accommodations, and they have. So remember that the Republic of Ireland gave up Articles 2 and 3 of its Constitution, which laid claim to the 6 counties in the north, where one of my grandmothers comes from. And the UK, they gave up the border. Now, I can assure you that we are never going back to a hard border on that island. I was there last summer with relatives, and it has worked splendidly. So we want to celebrate it, put it front and center. The DUP is not sitting in government at the moment, and we need to get them into government before this happens. So I think that if everybody could just once again lower the invective and lower the voices and say, what a startling achievement. What a startling achievement. I had the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in this week, and we had it's a better conversation than it was 30 years ago when we used to get together. Much better. And I said to him, you need to nudge them. And I said, we got you out of this. Bill Clinton had some courage on it. And he stood up to his own State Department, by the way, and said, we're going to do this. And he did it. Tony Blair gets credit, and John Major gets credit for it. But also the men and women who live there get a lot of credit for just putting aside these historic religious differences about identity, because that's really what it's still about, identity. And there's a new paradigm that I think is being established called Northern Irish. Rather than being identified as a unionist or a nationalist. So I think that 2 generations now of children have grown up in an area the size of the state of Connecticut who have not known the horrific violence. Unbelievable what's happened. Yeah. And I said to the secretary, and they're all there. It looks like the whole UK government was there, sitting in front of me. And I thought, me versus all of them, fair fight. But I raised this point. I said, if we were having this conversation when I first came to Congress, I started this immediately. It was the first speech I gave on the House floor about plastic bullets and rubber bullets. And I said to them, if we were having this conversation when I first came to Congress, you had 30,000 soldiers in an area the size of the state of Connecticut. The watchtowers that monitored the conversations, a policing establishment that was used to keep one section of the community in line, because that's really what it was about. All gone. If you go there today, people have gotten on with their lives. Belfast is a spectacular city. And Derry has always been grand. It's even more grand because of the investment that has taken place. I can't wait to get there to celebrate with everybody, but also to remind it was the American dimension as an honest broker, because the reach and the role of America still has a lot to do with achievement internationally. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? I just want to move around. Young lady here, why don't you just wait for the mic, and it'll be coming down very shortly. There you go. Yep.
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Catherine Webster, and I'm representing the National Federation of Blind, and also am a current student at Harvard Business School. My question is around employment for people with disabilities. Right now, many don't know, but the unemployment rate for blind folks is 75%, which is baffling. It's been stagnant for decades. What can we as society do, or Congress do, to help move that needle forward? Because much of it has to do with public misconceptions.
Well, thanks, first of all, for your advocacy and your courage. And as you know, the association, they were in this week in Washington, so we visited with them. I drive to work every day on what is known as Carew Street in Springfield, in the middle of the Hungry Hill section of the city. And I always go past the Federation for the Blind, and I always think in the earliest days, I was part of establishing that headquarters. And I think that the Americans with Disabilities Act has also moved things forward, but your continued advocacy is really important. And just to watch the courage of people this week all over Capitol Hill, it was just great, just great. So we are available to you. I also am carrying some legislation for you. Fred Griffey is your advocate in Washington. He's a longtime attorney, and he mentioned it to me yesterday morning at a breakfast that he attended on my behalf. And he asked me, he said, where are we? And I've got to get 2 new Republican co-sponsors because the last 2 left. Yeah. But thank you.
And you're active at the Disability Caucus there with...
Yes, yeah. I was an original sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right.
And let's give George Bush Sr. credit on the Americans with Disabilities Act, because he had some courage on it. And we celebrated this week family leave that he vetoed twice and Bill Clinton signed, and I was an original sponsor of that as well. So we hope, by the way, I don't want to cause too much indigestion, but the next step is paid family leave.
Okay. Gentleman in the rear, Sean, will give you the mic. Ask your question.
Congressman, thank you. Kurt Huffman with Mercury Systems. We're a defense and aerospace electronics company. They work in Andover, about 2,500 employees. You talked about tax incentives and indicators. And thank you so much for your support in the past for the R&D tax push, as we've now removed tax cuts jobs, by your amortization, which has been quite painful. And just wanted to ask you about your thoughts on whether that issue could be addressed.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that issue came up yesterday morning. I had not seen Dick Gephardt for a couple of years, and he came to an event for me yesterday morning, and he raised the question at the breakfast. I'm all in on the R&D and expanding and making it more robust. How can you come from Massachusetts and not be for an expanded or more robust R&D credit? Here's how we can unlock the room. I want to grow the child credit. An extraordinary story for all of us is what has happened to childhood poverty. It's been cut in half. And I was part of it. I helped to write the Affordable Care Act. And by the way, next week we have our Democratic Ways and Means retreat in New York City. And we get together with Bob Rubin and Jack Lew, Steve Ratner, we have human service people in, president of the AFL, president of SEIU is coming over, and so we hear from business people, labor people, and we want a nice conversation. But Charlie Rangel's coming to the dinner, 92. He was the chairman of the committee the night that we passed the Affordable Care Act, and I'll never forget it. 20 million more Americans have health insurance because of the Affordable Care Act. And let me say, credit to all of you in this room, every child in Massachusetts has health insurance. 97% of the children, 97% of the adults in Massachusetts have health insurance. Everybody was, you heard a lot of arguments for this plan or that plan. We passed the plan you could pass, that you could sell to the American people. And if we were going to go to the perfect, in the eyes of some, we couldn't have passed it. That's all there was to it. So, and by the way, Nancy Pelosi passed the Affordable Care Act. I mean, you talk about drill down, and Marty and I have a very good friend who was from Illinois at the time, and he said, I am not voting for this, Democrat. He said, it's terrible, I'm not voting for it. So I listened to this, he would sit with us on the floor and say, I'm not voting for this, Labor's against it. And I said, okay, I listened and was polite. So a couple of days before the vote, he sits down, he said, this is terrible. He said, he's had me down to the White House, I'm not voting for this. And I listened and I said, look, let me just tell you something. You're going to vote for this. I said, I've listened long enough. I said, here's the plan. We're going to figure out, do you surrender to Obama or to Pelosi? And I said, you're going to be here for a while. My advice, surrender to Pelosi. And she was laughing about that. But that's how we did it, inch by inch. And taking to the specific question you raised about R&D, I want to enhance the child tax credit. We've cut that poverty in half. Why? Because we expanded Medicaid, school nutrition programs, after-school programs, right? We need action on the child credit. Look what it did in the middle of the pandemic for people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum. The critics, I understand what they're saying, and they criticized me for it, because in working with the administration, we built a very high ceiling, and I know the accountants are here. So for joint filers, we said the ceiling was going to be $400,000. Our argument was, as Democrats, we've got to get away from, you're taking it away from us to give to them. Do you know what I mean? That's part of the problem we have politically. That you're taking it, so we said, okay, guess what? You're all in. You don't want it, send it back. But we built the ceiling high, and it worked. So here's my argument to the Republicans, and I've said this to them. And by the way, the evangelical community likes expanding the child credit. They think child poverty has been a stubborn part for too long of the American story. So let's expand the credits, and some that I'm not crazy about, you should know, but to get the deal for the child credit, I'm in. I want a bigger R&D credit. I'm okay, again, on expensing. I know some of my side might be crazy of expensing, but it's not about the perfect. Give me some room on the child credit, all in on R&D, all in on expensing. Immediate expensing, which is a big thing for many business people. That's the way you do legislation. So I'm okay with it, and I've got General Dynamics in Pittsfield. They have 1,300 employees, and cybersecurity is everything for them right now. They could hire 300 people tomorrow. They can't get them. They just can't get them. And you've got these small little contractors in Warren, Massachusetts, Warren Pump, 125 people there, just out to a celebration with them. They'd hire 25 people tomorrow if they could get them. You know what's happening in that industry with skill set. So that's the short answer and the long answer. Some room on the child credit, and I've talked to the president about this. This is our chance, and I think some of the evangelicals might move along some of the more conservative Republicans. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe you have a chance for maybe one or two questions. Becca Gould?
So
Jack
this is
Campbell.
less of a question and more building on the chairman's statement and the advocate for the
Want to wait? Just wait for the mic so you get. Here it is.
And the advocate for the Federation, I look forward to meeting afterwards. I serve under Jim on the governor's disability committee. And the one thing I would just like to do is appeal to all the employers in this room
to break down these barriers to education. I didn't know about that statistic, and it's shocking. And in our DE&I efforts in every company, we should make sure that people with disabilities are included. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to make that appeal.
Yeah, and thank Jim Brett for his lifelong advocacy on that issue. There's a call right there behind the camera. He's been waiting.
Okay, right behind the camera.
Right there.
As Sean's getting, I just want to let the young lady know from the Harvard Business, we are working with David D'Arcangelo, who's the commissioner for the Commission for the Blind here, on a pilot program with Marty Walsh, Department of Labor, for people who have vision impairment. So you may want to stay in touch with us, the New England Council. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Congressman Sean Carpenter from Concord Realty Development, affordable housing developer nationally. I grew up in the district, but because of commuting in Boston, it was so difficult. I actually grew up here now, but that's not what I was on.
That's why we need East-West Rail.
Your staff, as chairman of the Ways and Means, and you personally have been a huge advocate for the low-income housing tax credit, and we lost out in the infrastructure bill, and we lost out in the IRA,
Yeah.
and then the omnibus. And we know that inflation is one of the biggest challenges to inflation is housing costs.
Yep.
What I want to ask is, in the new Congress, what are our chances of getting more funding to the housing tax credit to the tax exempt on things?
Yeah, actually very good. And that's part of the package that I just described. I'm all in on the low-income housing tax credit, as you know, and I'm all in on the historic tax credit. And I've been one of the original authors of new markets tax credits. So I also, let me use the opportunity to thank Charlie Baker. He had real courage on housing. Housing is income elastic, as you know. And the problem is local zoning laws. And too many times people say, well, just put it in the city. Well, housing is based on need. And if we're not generating sufficient units, it drives up the cost for everybody else in the housing market. So I thought Baker was really good, and I noticed that yesterday the legislature is moving again in that direction. But we actually saved those in the bottom of the ninth inning in the Republican tax plan that I voted against. But I used the opportunity publicly to question what had happened to those three credits. I knew what had happened, but I needed to get it on the record. They put it back in afterwards. And the easiest thing for me to have done would have been to say, oh, let's do an in-zone dance, spike the football. Instead, I said, thanks for doing it. You did the right thing. I wanted it done. And look, there's plenty of credit to be shared and things like that. And if people do the right thing, we're supposed to say so. Yeah. Yeah.
One final question, and it'll be from General Jack Hammond of Home Base. I think many of you know about Home Base, how they take care of the returning Afghan, Iraqi veterans and their families. Nationally recognized program, Mass General, Boston Red Sox. General?
General?
I've got a good news story and a follow-up question. For about a decade, Jim has helped Home Base work to try and get some legislation in place to help fund some of the work that we do. We treat the most injured veterans, military family members, and special operations team members in the country using the resources from Mass General, Harvard, Mass General Operating System. We've had 3 close calls where we got it into the NDAA, passed it through appropriations, and then as we got to the end zone, somebody repurposed the money. It got moved in another direction. So we had 3 swings, 3 misses after about 8 years of work. We were able, Senator Markey was able to go a different route, went to Health and Human Services for an earmark last year for the military families of our fallen. And they fall between the gap because when their service member dies, it's not part of the DoD. They're not a veteran, so they're not part of the VA, and that no man's land. But they don't get the care they need. There's a subset of the families that survived from suicide. We've lost 150,000 veterans to suicide in the last 20 years, which is just a stunning number. These spouses oftentimes witness the suicide or walk in on it, so they're as injured as any veteran I've ever met. The $1 million is going to go to pay for the care to treat them this year because there's no other way to fund it. I'm kind of curious with the into the budget. And I think that's the perfect, use for it.
Yeah.
For national programs or local programs, just need to be funded, and there's no other mechanism to support that.
You should know I would give you a hand on that, and even though it's centered here in Boston, I would get after that, because some of them we share with other members of the delegation. I'm a big believer in earmarking, and a real big believer in earmarking. I used to go crazy with the ones that would take it and then they wouldn't defend it in public. So we will help you on that, and I put you in the right direction on it. If you came to Western Massachusetts, you'd see a lot of earmarks. I served with Silvio Conti. Some of you might remember him. And half of Berkshire County is named after Silvio Conti. And wherever Sil is, he's saying it's not enough.
Boston College.
Yeah, Boston College, the Conti Center. And, he'd have that cigar. He'd roll the cigar, and he thought he looked like a million with the check sport coat and the striped shirts and all, And his secret was he played bridge with Tip. And he hung around with Tip. He's a Republican from the 1st District. And you just would marvel if you went up to the Berkshires. And the joke with the staff was that people would come in and say, we really need this. And Silvio would say, that's impossible. That can't be done. And they'd let a couple of days go by, and the staff would call and say, what are the prospects about naming it after the congressman? And all of a sudden it was a priority. And but I call attention to that because some of the most powerful moments for me was in the aftermath of the Iraqi invasion, the landmines, what they did to these kids. And to go and visit, a young man from Bellingham, I'll never forget it as long as I live, 2 legs and an arm. And he says to me, I'm honored that you would visit. Me visiting, a congressman visiting somebody who just gave that for the country? And his wife was there, and I thought, in 6 months, this is going to get really hard. So anything we can do on that front to help out, because also defending these soldiers' homes, we have one in Holyoke that I put a lot of money into, getting it a new one. The Veterans Hospital in Northampton, I earmarked a lot of money for that as well. I think those are reasonable positions. And, Congress is mentioned as the first branch of government in the Constitution. And when the critics would say to me, well, we need the line item veto, or you're turning spending over to the White House, I would say, members of Congress don't serve under presidents. You serve with presidents. And the idea that they have more knowledge down, and I would say to the Republicans, I said, so you're complaining all the time about Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. And I've said, and then you turn spending over to them. I wouldn't turn it over to Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, or Biden. Congress decides how that money is allocated. And you can work with the administration for priorities, but even now with earmarking, I noticed the Republican Senate caucus, 2 of them are now against it, that's it, because it's a good way to connect with people. And, spectacular courthouse in Springfield, Union Station, all these great achievements. I've never gotten one letter or one phone call saying, would you send the money back? And the requests come from local government, veterans organizations, hospitals, and universities and colleges. Yes,
One final question. Gary Kaplan. Gary, I just want to let you know before you ask the question, Congressman has a 2 o'clock flight. Doesn't want to be late, so, okay? Quick question.
Thank you, I'll keep that brief. Congressman, you mentioned a couple of companies in Massachusetts can't find skilled employees. And we know that the skilled workforce development is a huge issue here and in every place, but especially here. We do online educational support in the K-12 system, and we are grappling with the whole issue of the effects of the pandemic on skills of our coming workforce. The K-12 system is our workforce development system. Do you have any initiatives moving through the Congress now that would help the K-12 system both recover from the effects of the pandemic and raise skill standards across the board to the level that our economy actually is
Yeah, great question, and nice to see you again in person. The state hasn't spent all of the money that we provided. I had a hilarious moment on all the money that came back to the state, and you can tell I treasure these moments because it's human nature. So when I called Governor Baker, I said, let me tell you something. You're about to get a lot of money. He had no idea. And I don't say that. Nobody did. But I had been part of the formula. And so I said, we need to do a press conference. And Marty was part of it, one of his friends. And some of the people around the governor said, we're going to have the Democratic chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. We're not so sure that this is a good look for you as a Republican governor with more money. So I said, they said, well, how much is it? I said, about $14 billion. We'll be there. So I noticed during the press conference, the governor and the lieutenant governor at the State House, they were standing over by the window as I was speaking. And as I said, there's $1 billion for this and $1 billion for that. I noticed he kept inching closer to me. And finally, for the photo, he was right there with his arm around me. And I just to point out that there is money still at the legislative level with the governor that hasn't been spent yet, and you ought to zero in on that. Because I had that question, something similar to it came up on the plane last night coming up. Somebody saw me and they decided to make good use of their time. But I would, your local legislators and all, there's still some of that money that has not been expended yet. It's always a joy to come to the New England Council. Thank you all.